Welcome back. Tonight, we explore the sprawling, blood-soaked, brilliantly strange world of Resident Evil lore. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. The progenitor that started it all. There is a flower that grows in the ruins of an ancient garden, buried beneath the soil of West Africa. And inside that flower lives the seed of every nightmare the Resident Evil universe has ever produced. The Indipaya tribe had worshipped it for generations, naming it the Sonnentreppe, or Stairway of the Sun. The rare few who consumed the flower and survived emerged with superhuman abilities, and the tribe revered them as gods. European aristocrats Edward Ashford, Oswald Spencer, and James Marcus discovered the flower in 1966 during an expedition, correctly deducing that a retrovirus living inside it was responsible for those extraordinary mutations. They named that retrovirus the progenitor virus, and Marcus went further, theorizing that this ancient pathogen may have been responsible for triggering the very origin of life on Earth. It is hundreds of millions of years old. Every zombie, every monster, every lab-spawned horror across 30 years of games traces its lineage directly to that single flower in a forgotten underground garden. Umbrella was not born from ambition alone. It was born from a flower. 3 men, 1 dream, 0 morals. The 3 men who discovered the progenitor virus did not share equal vision, and that tension shaped everything. Edward Ashford was primarily interested in the virus's regenerative potential, hoping to use it to help people born with disabilities. James Marcus was consumed by pure scientific curiosity, wanting to study how the virus mutated in leech hosts and other organisms. And Oswald Spencer wanted something far darker, a new world order. Spencer's dream was eugenics on a cosmic scale. He wanted to use the progenitor virus to trigger forced human evolution, killing off those he deemed genetically inferior and preserving only the elite. He tolerated his 2 partners long enough to found Umbrella Pharmaceuticals in 1967. But the collaboration was always a means to an end. Spencer had the money, the connections, and the patience of a man who thought in decades rather than years. From the very first meeting, the future of the Resident Evil universe was already being written in bad faith. James Marcus was murdered by his own students. Dr. James Marcus, co-founder of Umbrella Pharmaceuticals, and the scientist who created the T-virus on September 19, 1978, was betrayed and assassinated by 2 of his most promising pupils, Albert Wesker and William Birkin, both barely teenagers at the time. Spencer had grown concerned that Marcus was becoming a liability. His mental state was deteriorating. He was increasingly protective of his research, and he posed a risk to Spencer's greater plans. Spencer ordered Wesker and Birkin to eliminate him and seize his research. The 2 young prodigies gunned Marcus down without hesitation, and his body and research materials were discarded. Umbrella told the world he had simply retired, but the progenitor virus had other plans. A single T-virus infected leech survived, feeding on Marcus's corpse for nearly a decade, absorbing his DNA and memories until the creature revived and reformed in his image. The man who created the T-virus was murdered by children and resurrected by the insects he experimented on. Justice in Resident Evil lore is always grotesque. The T-virus was made from leech, the breakthrough that transformed the progenitor virus into the tyrant virus, the T-virus, the pathogen responsible for zombies, BOWs, and the destruction of Raccoon City. came specifically from James Marcus, combining progenitor with leech DNA. The leeches showed a unique ability to absorb and process the virus's mutagenic properties in a more controlled way than early mammalian test subjects. By synthesizing progenitor with the genetic material of leeches, Marcus created a strain that could animate dead tissue, infect nearly any host organism, and survive outside a controlled laboratory environment. The breakthrough happened on September 19, 1978, at the Umbrella Executive Training School in the Arklay Mountains. Marcus detailed the discovery in personal journals that are scattered across the events of Resident Evil 0 as environmental documents. Every zombie shuffling through the streets of Raccoon City, every monster ever created by Umbrella, they all exist because of what James Marcus did with a leech in a mountain facility in 1978. The Raccoon City Police Department was a museum. One of Resident Evil 2's most enduring questions is why the Raccoon City Police Department looks absolutely nothing like a police station. The answer, buried in the game's lore documents, is that the building is a former art museum that was repurposed. In the late 19th century, the building was constructed as a museum in the European style, featuring grand stone staircases, decorative fountains, stained glass windows, and ornate halls. When Raccoon City began growing rapidly in the early 20th century and needed a larger police headquarters, the city purchased the former museum and converted it. The conversion was never complete. The officers simply began working within the museum's original architecture, using former exhibition halls as offices and storage rooms, while much of the building retained its museum character. The iconic statues, the elaborate doors requiring crests, the impractical layout, it all makes sense when you realize the building was designed to display art, not house police. Chief Irons kept it this way intentionally, fostering an environment of strange grandeur that matched his own monstrous ego. Brian Irons was Umbrella's insurance policy. Chief Brian Irons, the corrupt and disturbing police chief of Raccoon City, was not simply a bad person in a position of authority. He was deliberately recruited, cultivated, and maintained by Umbrella. The corporation had identified him early in his career as someone with criminal tendencies and moral flexibility, and they began providing him with financial incentives to ensure the Raccoon City Police Department would never investigate their activities in the Arklay region. Irons accepted bribes for years, ensuring any complaints against Umbrella were buried, and any officers who asked too many questions were reassigned or disciplined. When the outbreak began, Irons received orders to help Umbrella contain information leaking out of the city. He murdered survivors. He obstructed evacuation efforts. He kept the police station from functioning as a refuge. His psychological deterioration during the events of RE2, which ends in his obsession with taxidermy and his attempted murder of Claire, was partly the result of G-virus infection. Umbrella had corrupted him long before the virus ever touched him. The G-virus was hidden inside a little girl's locket. When Ada Wong infiltrated Raccoon City on behalf of Umbrella's unnamed rival organization, her mission was to retrieve a sample of the G-virus. What she did not initially know was that a sample had already been extracted and hidden by Sherry Birkin's mother, Annette, inside the pendant that Sherry wore around her neck. The locket contained a G-virus sample that Annette had secured as insurance. It was not until Ada found the pendant that Sherry had dropped and later investigated it that the connection was made. The entire chain of events connecting Sherry's infection, the race through the sewers, Ada's double cross, and the final confrontation with the mutated William Birkin in the underground lab. All of it hinges on a piece of jewelry worn by a young girl who had no idea what she was carrying. Sherry Birkin unknowingly walked through a dying city with the most dangerous virus in the world hanging from her neck, surrounded by the very monsters it created. William Birkin chose the virus over his family. Dr. William Birkin, the scientific genius behind the G virus, and one of the most tragic figures in the original Resident Evil saga, had every opportunity to leave Raccoon City and save himself and his family before the outbreak. Instead, he chose his research. The G virus had consumed his entire sense of identity. In his mind, he was on the verge of the most important scientific discovery in human history, and he refused to let Umbrella claim credit for it. When Umbrella sent agents to seize his research in September 1998, he resisted, was shot multiple times, and in a last act of desperation, injected himself with the G virus rather than allow it to be taken. The resulting mutation transformed him into an increasingly unrecognizable creature that attacked his own wife Annette, infected his daughter Sherry, and spent the rest of its existence killing anything it encountered. Birkin was so devoted to his virus that he became it. He did not save his family or his work. He just became one more monster in a city full of them. The water supply was ground zero. The Raccoon City T-virus outbreak did not begin with a dramatic act of terrorism or sabotage. It began with rats, when the Umbrella mercenary team ambushed William Birkin, and he injected himself with the G virus. The subsequent chaos in the sewer below the city resulted in several T-virus vials being dropped and shattered. The leaking viral fluid seeped into a drainage system that was accessible to Raccoon City's resident rat population. The infected rats then traveled throughout the city's underground infrastructure, biting and contaminating the water supply at the Raccoon Reservoir, which fed the city's taps. By September 23, 1998, the T-virus had entered the city's drinking water. From that point, every resident who turned on their faucet was potentially exposed. People began turning in their homes before they ever saw a zombie on the street. The collapse of Raccoon City began not with a bomb or a war, but with contaminated water and rats doing what rats have always done: spreading disease. 100,000 people were killed to cover it up. The destruction of Raccoon City on October 1st, 1998, is one of the most chilling events in Resident Evil lore. Not because of what was done, but because of why. The US government did not destroy the city solely to stop the outbreak. According to canon law documents, a key motivation was to eliminate evidence of the government's own complicity with Umbrella Corporation and their knowledge of its bioweapons research. Derek C. Simmons, a national security advisor who would become a villain in Resident Evil 6, played a significant role in authorizing the missile strike. The official public account blamed a malfunction at the Raccoon City nuclear power facility. The true death toll was at minimum 100,000 people. Those who knew the truth were discredited, arrested, or silenced. The entire city was declared a biohazard exclusion zone, and the President of the United States resigned in disgrace, faced with the public outcry of having ordered a missile strike on American soil. The cover-up was as monstrous as the outbreak. The Albert Wesker who appeared in RE1 wasn't really Albert Wesker. This is one of the most layered facts in the entire series. The Albert Wesker you encounter at the end of the original Resident Evil, the treacherous STARS captain, apparent Umbrella double agent, seemingly killed by the Tyrant, had been planning his own death all along. Wesker arranged to be impaled by the T-002 Tyrant to administer a prototype virus he had received from William Birkin. The controlled death was necessary to trigger the virus's activation sequence. The virus, informally called T-Wesker, was designed to rewrite his cells completely, granting him superhuman strength, speed, regenerative capability, and reflexes beyond human limits. When Wesker survived the tyrant's strike and slipped out of the burning mansion, he was no longer technically a human being. He had used the chaos he orchestrated to perform a biological resurrection on himself. The Wesker, who returns in code Veronica RE5 and beyond, is post-human, and he had been planning that transformation since before the events of the first game even began. Wesker received his doctorate at age 17. Albert Wesker, it turns out, wasn't simply a gifted child who rose through Umbrella's ranks. He was identified as exceptional before he even entered their ecosystem. As part of Project W, Umbrella's secret eugenics program overseen by Spencer, Wesker was one of hundreds of children selected based on the genetic quality of their parents. He was given a new surname, placed in the best educational environment money could provide, and monitored closely. His intelligence was staggering. He obtained his doctorate in virology while he was still 17 years old. For context, most scientists complete their doctorates in their late 20s at the earliest. Wesker did it as a teenager. He then began working as a senior researcher at Umbrella almost immediately, alongside the equally prodigious William Birkin, both of them barely adults in one of the most dangerous research environments on Earth. Spencer had successfully grown a weapon wearing a lab coat, and neither Wesker nor Birkin ever fully grasped how comprehensively they had been engineered. Hundreds of children were named Wesker. Project W, the eugenics program that produced Albert Wesker, was not designed around one child. Spencer collected hundreds of children from around the world, selecting them based on their parents' intellectual and genetic merit. In many cases, the children were kidnapped or adopted under false pretenses. Every single one of them was given the surname Wesker, after the unnamed project director who ran the program. They were raised in controlled environments, educated to Spencer's specific values, and monitored continuously without their knowledge. The goal was to identify which children would successfully bond with a prototype progenitor-derived virus that Spencer hoped would create the next stage of humanity. By 1998, the program had been narrowed to 13 final candidates who were each infected, often through manipulation, deception, or force. 11 of those candidates died from the infection. Only 2 survived: Albert, who became the series' primary villain, and Alex, his adoptive sister, who became the antagonist of Revelations 2. Spencer created monsters while calling it evolution. Every last one of those children was someone's lost child. Albert Wesker and Leon Kennedy never met in the games. This is one of the most startling gaps in the entire Resident Evil timeline. Albert Wesker is widely considered the most dangerous villain in the franchise's history. Leon Kennedy is arguably its most iconic hero. And in the canonical video game storyline, the two characters never once encountered each other in any mainline installment. Wesker was the dominant antagonist through RE1, code Veronica, RE4, and RE5, dying in a volcanic crater in that final entry. Leon was the protagonist of RE2, RE4, and RE6. In RE4, Wesker appears only through communications with Ada Wong, pulling strings behind the scenes while Leon and Sadler clash in the foreground. The closest they come to sharing a scene is through Proxy. For a franchise built around overlapping characters and interconnected narratives, the absence of a direct confrontation between its greatest hero and greatest villain is remarkable. and quietly brilliant. Some meetings never happen. Some enemies you defeat without ever looking each other in the eye. The umbrella logo came from a village in Eastern Europe. One of the most jaw-dropping retcons in all of Resident Evil lore arrived with Resident Evil Village in 2021. The iconic red and white Umbrella Corporation logo, one of the most recognized corporate symbols in gaming, did not originate as a corporate design. It was based on a symbol that Oswald Spencer saw when he visited Mother Miranda's village as a young man in the 1950s. The symbol represented the four noble houses of the village: the Dimitrescus, the Beneviventos, the Moreaus, and the Heisenbergs, arranged in a pattern around a central mark. Spencer encountered this symbol as a lost hiker who stumbled into the village and was taken in by Miranda as a protege. He was so moved by what he witnessed that when he eventually founded Umbrella Pharmaceuticals years later, he adapted that symbol into the company's logo. The corporation that terrorized the world for decades wore the symbol of an isolated pagan cult as its face. The origin of Umbrella was always Miranda's village, not a boardroom. Mother Miranda is the origin of almost everything. Resident Evil Village does something extraordinary with its lore. It retroactively positions Mother Miranda as the single most influential figure in the entire franchise's history. Miranda was a 19th century biologist living in a remote Eastern European village who lost her daughter Ava to the Spanish flu in 1919. In her grief, she entered a cave to die and instead discovered the Megamycete, an ancient fungal supercolony that infected her, extended her life, and gave her access to the accumulated memories of everyone the organism had ever consumed. Over the following century, Miranda conducted experiments on her villagers, attempting to create a vessel that could house Eva's consciousness. She failed, producing monsters instead, including the four lords who served as Resident Evil Village's antagonists. In the 1950s, she mentored the young Oswald Spencer, teaching him about the mold's mutagenic properties. Spencer took that knowledge home and built Umbrella around it. Without Miranda, there is no progenitor research, no T-virus, no Umbrella, no Wesker, no Raccoon City. Miranda accidentally created everything. She just wanted her daughter back. The Megamycete is older than recorded history. The Megamycete, the ancient fungal supercolony that infected Mother Miranda and serves as the ultimate biological antagonist of Resident Evil Village, is not a recent creation. According to lore established in the game's documents and supplementary materials, the Megamycete predates human civilization by a vast margin. The organism has been consuming and preserving the memories and biological material of every living thing that has come into contact with it over an incalculable period of time. Miranda discovered that within the organism's collective memory, she could find Ava, her dead daughter's consciousness preserved among thousands of others. The Megamycete functions as a kind of biological internet, linking all infected organisms across a shared hive memory. This also explains how Ethan Winters, who had been fundamentally transformed by the mold following the events of RE7, was able to manifest within the Megamycete and communicate with Rose after his physical death. The game's final act is essentially a father's consciousness lingering inside an ancient fungal god to say goodbye to his daughter. The horror and the tenderness coexist. Ethan Winters was dead the whole time. Ethan Winters, the protagonist of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, was clinically dead when both games took place. During the events of RE7, in one of the game's earliest sequences, Ethan is attacked by Mia and has his left hand severed by a chainsaw. He reattaches it with staples. This is treated as a moment of dark survival horror absurdity. But the deeper truth is that Ethan had already died at the Baker house before the game's events. When he first arrived and Jack Baker attacked him, the trauma of those initial injuries should have been fatal. The mold, however, had entered his bloodstream, likely through Mia's bite, and began repairing him in real time. By the game's midpoint, Ethan is no longer fully human. He is sustained by the mold's regenerative properties. In RE Village, this is confirmed explicitly. Mother Miranda reveals that Ethan has been dead all along, that his body has been maintained by fungal biology since the Baker house, and that he technically died years before Rose was even born. Ethan's entire character arc is a dead man trying to protect his family, and he does it anyway. Lady Dimitrescu was designed to be exactly 9 feet 6 inches tall. The internet's infatuation with Lady Alcina, Dimitrescu from Resident Evil Village, became a cultural phenomenon within days of the game's announcement in 2021. The tall, elegant, vampire-adjacent aristocrat in a wide-brimmed hat and long white dress generated an immediate and overwhelming response online, and Capcom acknowledged the character's popularity while the game was still in development. But here is the precise lore detail that adds another layer. Lady Dimitrescu's height of 9 feet and 6 inches is not an accident or an approximation. It was specified by the game's developers as an intentional design choice to make her feel genuinely overwhelming and inescapable in the narrow corridors of her castle. She cannot fully stand upright in most of the castle's hallways. When she pursued Ethan through the tight passages of her domain, she had to crouch and twist to follow. Her imposing stature was architecturally inconvenient even for herself. The castle was built before Miranda transformed her, and she never quite fit in, which was entirely the point. Lady Dimitrescu was a failed resurrection attempt. For all her magnificence as an antagonist and a character, Alcina Dimitrescu was, by Miranda's own assessment, a failure. Miranda had implanted Dimitrescu with the Cadu parasite, her engineered vehicle for introducing the mold's mutagenic properties into human subjects, hoping that Dimitrescu would become a suitable vessel for Ava's consciousness. The result was a partial success. Dimitrescu survived the Cadu implantation, gaining extraordinary regenerative ability, enhanced physicality, and a severely disrupted metabolism that required constant consumption of human blood to maintain. But she did not become the vessel Miranda needed. The Cadu could not suppress Dimitrescu's own consciousness sufficiently to allow Ava to manifest within her. So Miranda kept her as an asset, gave her a castle, elevated her to nobility, and let her live her existence as one of the 4 lords. Alcina Dimitrescu was never supposed to be Lady Dimitrescu. She was supposed to be Eva. Miranda kept her because a useful failed experiment is still useful. The most beloved character in RE Village existed because the villain ran out of good alternatives. Donna Beneviento's domain was the scariest part of the game by design. House Beneviento, the fog-shrouded, flower-covered estate, run by the grief-stricken doll maker Donna Beneviento, was designed to be categorically different from the rest of Resident Evil Village. While the castle and factory leaned into gothic grandeur and industrial horror, Benevento's manor pursued pure psychological dread. The development team deliberately stripped away almost all of the game's usual survival horror conventions, no weapons, no combat, no merchant, to create an experience of helplessness. The haunting sequence involving the pursuit through the basement hallways by a creature the game never fully explains is widely regarded as one of the most terrifying sequences in modern horror gaming. Capcom's internal playtesting reportedly confirmed that American colleagues found Donna and her puppet Angie significantly scarier than any other section of the game. The irony is that Donna herself is arguably the most sympathetic of the four lords. A deeply traumatized woman who lost her father and retreated into a world of dolls, never fully capable of distinguishing grief from malice. Carl Heisenberg was smarter than everyone else in the room. Carl Heisenberg, the sardonic, factory-running lord with electromagnetic powers and an industrial aesthetic, stands apart from the other lords in one crucial way. He knew exactly what Miranda was doing to all of them, and he hated her for it. While Dimitrescu, Beneviento, and Moreau all operated within Miranda's system with varying degrees of awareness and devotion, Heisenberg had fully mapped her intentions and spent years looking for a way to break free. His proposal to Ethan, that the two of them combine forces, with Ethan using Heisenberg's assembled mechanical army to destroy Miranda, while Rose was weaponized against her, was the most strategically sound plan presented in the entire game. It failed because Ethan refused to use his daughter as a weapon, which is entirely understandable, but also the reason Heisenberg died, having never escaped Miranda's shadow. He was the most perceptive person in the village, trapped in a web he could see clearly and could not escape. His death is one of the game's most quietly tragic moments. Salvatore Moreau was the most rejected being in the village. Of the four lords, Salvatore Moreau occupies the most pitiable position in the law. Unlike Dimitrescu's commanding presence, Beneviento's isolation, or Heisenberg's resentful defiance, Moreau is fully aware that he is the weakest and least favored of Miranda's adopted children. His personal notes and journal entries scattered throughout his reservoir domain reveal a man crushed by the weight of Miranda's indifference. He worships her with a sincerity that borders on desperation, performing dark rituals and experiments in hopes of earning her approval, and she never gives it. His mutation, the Kadu, caused him to physically deteriorate into a misshapen, fish-like form, left him without any of the grandeur or power that the other lords possessed. He is simply broken and sad and devoted to someone who views him as an afterthought. When Ethan encounters him, Moreau's hostility is driven not by ambition, but by the terrified scrambling of someone who knows his position is worthless and is trying to prove otherwise. He is frightening because he is pathetic. He is pathetic because he is human. Resident Evil 4 was originally Devil May Cry. The first proposed version of Resident Evil 4 was directed by Hideki Kamiya and followed a character named Tony, who possessed superhuman abilities explained through biotechnology. The game had a radically different tone from previous RE entries. Stylish, fast, and focused on action over survival horror. Shinji Mikami, who had handed control of RE4's development to Kamiya, felt the project had strayed too far from the franchise's identity. Rather than scrap the work entirely, Mikami suggested reworking it into a completely new property. That rework project became Devil May Cry, one of Capcom's most beloved franchises, released for PlayStation 2 in 2001. The brooding Tony became the white-haired Dante, the biotechnology became demon powers, and the whole concept of a stylish action hero was given a mythology that fitted better. So the next time you play Devil May Cry, remember, you are playing an alternate universe version of Resident Evil 4. The franchise that redefined action gaming was essentially Capcom's way of saying, this is too cool for Resident Evil. Resident Evil 4 went through 4 scrapped versions. After the Devil May Cry split, development of Resident Evil 4 started over, and then started over again, and again, and again. The second attempt, sometimes called the Fog version or Castle version, placed Leon Kennedy inside a fog-shrouded European castle that had once been Umbrella's headquarters. A mysterious black fog enemy was a key feature, but animating the fog exceeded the technical capabilities of the GameCube hardware, and the version was scrapped. The third attempt, known as the hallucination version, placed Leon in a mansion where a virus caused him to hallucinate supernatural entities. This version introduced the over-the-shoulder camera perspective for the first time, and featured the Hookman, a spectral enemy pursuing Leon throughout the estate. It too was cancelled due to technical limitations. A fourth brief attempt revived traditional zombies, but was abandoned almost immediately. Only on the fifth attempt did Mikami himself step in, replace the supernatural enemies with parasitized villagers called Ganados, and create the game the world eventually played in 2005. The Hookman almost changed everything. The hallucination version of Resident Evil 4 that featured the Hookman, a ghostly figure carrying a large hook who would relentlessly pursue Leon through a mansion haunted by paranormal entities, is considered by fans and developers alike to be one of the most tantalizing roads not taken in gaming history. Footage shown at E3 2003 revealed a version of RE4 that looked like it might have reinvented horror gaming years before Amnesia, Outlast, or the PT demo. The atmosphere was suffocating. The over-the-shoulder camera that this version introduced was genuinely innovative, and the concept of a single relentless enemy stalking you through a haunted space anticipated the design philosophy that would dominate horror games a decade later. It was scrapped because the GameCube couldn't load two simultaneous versions of each room simultaneously. One real, one hallucinatory, as the design required. The Hookman became a ghost story about a ghost, a cancelled nightmare that haunts every horror game that came after it. George Romero was hired and then fired for the RE movie. George A. Romero, the director of Night of the Living Dead and the godfather of modern zombie cinema, is one of Shinji Mikami's admitted inspirations for the Resident Evil franchise. When Capcom decided to develop a film adaptation of the series in the late 1990s, Romero was the first person they approached. He had already directed an advertising campaign for Biohazard 2 in Japan, and the relationship seemed natural. Romero accepted the commission and submitted a screenplay based closely on the original game story, featuring Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and the Spencer Mansion. Constantin Films, the production company involved, liked the script. Their head, however, did not. The project was taken away from Romero and given to Paul W.S. Anderson, who created the film series starring Mila Jovovich's original character Alice. Romero's script, which would have been a faithful adaptation, was never produced. The franchise, built on Romero's zombie mythology, declined to let its actual creator make the movie. That is among the more painful what-ifs in horror film history. The Game Boy Color port was 98% complete before being cancelled. In 1999, a British studio called HotGen was commissioned to port the original Resident Evil to the Game Boy Color. The undertaking was considered nearly impossible given the hardware disparity between the PlayStation original and the underpowered handheld, but HotGen got to work. By early 2000, the port was an estimated 98% complete, according to the lead programmer, having successfully compressed the game's pre-rendered backgrounds, retained the voice acting in a severely compressed form, and adapted the controls to the GBC's limited button layout. Capcom cancelled it anyway, citing quality concerns. The game sat unreleased for over a decade until a copy leaked online in 2012. Players who discovered the leaked build found it to be a remarkable technical achievement. Imperfect, limited, sometimes missing animations and enemies, but genuinely faithful to the source material. A near-complete Game Boy Color version of Resident Evil sat in a drawer for 12 years, while fans assumed it never existed. In 2024, an even more complete build was finally archived and made publicly accessible online. Nemesis was the first BOW that could follow orders and pursue a specific target. The Nemesis T-Type, the relentless pursuer at the heart of Resident Evil 3, represented a significant breakthrough in Umbrella's bioweapons research, and a terrifying one. Previous Tyrant models, including the T-002 from the Spencer Mansion and the T-103S deployed in Raccoon City, were capable of following basic directives, but their intelligence was limited and their target recognition was rudimentary. Nemesis was different. It was implanted with the NE alpha parasite, a sentient organism that bonded with and enhanced the tyrant's brain, giving it the cognitive ability to recognize specific individuals, pursue them through complex environments, and adapt its tactics when conventional approaches failed. Umbrella's primary objective for Nemesis was the elimination of all surviving STARS members, as they were the only people who had witnessed Umbrella's research firsthand and could provide credible testimony. The fact that Jill Valentine was its primary target was not coincidence. She was the most dangerous witness, and Umbrella sent something unprecedented to silence her permanently. Jill Valentine's blood gave the world its only T-virus vaccine. During the events of Resident Evil 5, the revelation that Albert Wesker had been keeping a mind-controlled Jill Valentine prisoner for years raises a question. Why? Wesker himself provides part of the answer. He was studying the antibodies Jill's body had developed after her exposure to the T-virus during the events of Raccoon City and her subsequent experimental treatment. Jill is one of the few known humans to have survived direct T-virus exposure and developed a genuine immune response. This made her blood exceptionally valuable for research purposes. The P30 compound Wesker used to control her was chosen in part because of how it interacted with her unique biology. Her survival from T-virus infection was not just a personal miracle. It was the closest thing the world had to a medical breakthrough in fighting Umbrella's creations. The woman who was almost a Jill sandwich in 1998 had, a decade later, become a walking laboratory for the only effective T-virus countermeasure the series ever produces. Code. Veronica connected two worlds. Nobody knew were connected. Resident Evil Code. Veronica, released in 2000 for the Dreamcast, is one of the most lore-dense entries in the franchise's history, and one of the most overlooked. The game follows Claire Redfield as she tracks her brother Chris to Umbrella's Antarctic base, where she encounters the Ashford twins, Alfred, who is mentally unstable and has been impersonating his long-deceased sister Alexia, and Alexia herself, who had put herself into cryogenic sleep for 15 years, while the T-Veronica virus slowly integrated with her biology. The T-Veronica virus was created by synthesizing the progenitor virus with the DNA of a queen ant that contained an ancient viral strain, then allowing it to incubate for over a decade inside Alexia's unconscious body. The result was a human being who could control fire and mentally dominate insects. Code. Veronica also introduced Steve Burnside, whose death is one of the franchise's most unexpectedly affecting moments, and Albert Wesker, now visibly post-human and coldly calculating. The game is essential lore and chronically underappreciated. Alexia Ashford spent 15 years asleep to become a monster. Alexia Ashford was a child prodigy who graduated from university at age 10, published groundbreaking research as a preteen, and had joined Umbrella as a senior researcher before most people complete secondary school. She was also deeply aware that the T. Veronica virus she had created would destroy any host who received it under normal circumstances. So she devised a method to survive it: cryogenic sleep lasting 15 years, allowing the virus to slowly adapt to her biology rather than overwhelming it. She entered her cryogenic chamber in 1983 and emerged in 1998, physiologically transformed. The virus had merged with her completely, granting her fire manipulation, enhanced physical abilities, and the capacity to mentally dominate arthropods. The plan worked almost perfectly. Alexia Ashford is arguably the most extreme example in the series of someone who deliberately engineered their own transformation into a superhuman with full awareness of what they were doing. She was 15 when she went under. She was 30 when she woke up, and she was no longer human. The progenitor virus was originally called the clay virus. During early development of the original Resident Evil, the mutagenic viral agent at the center of the story was called the clay virus, a name conceived by Capcom planner Kenichi Iwao. The concept already established that multiple generations of the virus existed, the foundational clay strain and derivative variants. This early design document DNA survived into the finished game and its companion materials, but the name itself was replaced by more evocative terminology in the final product. The expanded mythology developed through code, Veronica, Resident Evil 0, and later Resident Evil 5 retroactively formalized the origin story, renaming the foundational pathogen the progenitor virus, a name developed primarily by flagship writer Noboru Sugimura, who handled much of the canonical lore expansion in the early 2000s. The name Clay Virus never appeared in a finished game. It exists only in design documents and official companion books as a relic of an earlier era, a ghost of Resident Evil's original lore framework. The original RE2 was scrapped when it was 70% complete. The version of Resident Evil 2 that players know and love is not the first Resident Evil 2 Capcom made. The original version, now known among fans as Resident Evil 1.5, was in development and reached approximately 70% completion before Capcom decided it was fundamentally wrong and scrapped it entirely. The 1.5 version featured a different female protagonist named Elza Walker instead of Claire Redfield, and a police station that had been modernized and redesigned to feel more contemporary. When professional screenwriter Noboru Sugimura was brought in to provide story consultation, he delivered a blunt assessment. The setting had lost the ominous, puzzle-haunted atmosphere of the first game. It felt too sterile, too realistic, too devoid of the gothic strangeness that defined Spencer Mansion. His recommendation was to throw the work away. Capcom did exactly that. The game was redeveloped almost from scratch, with Sugimura explicitly suggesting that making Police Chief Irons wildly eccentric and disturbed was the right way to bring back the series' distinctive character. The weirdo police chief was born from the ashes of a failed project. Sadler was using Las Plagas to replace gunpowder with biology. Osmond Sadler, the cult leader antagonist of Resident Evil 4, was not simply a religious fanatic who happened to have access to a mind-controlling parasite. He was a sophisticated bioterrorist with a specific strategic vision. The Las Plagas parasite, which Los Iluminados had cultivated and refined in the remote Spanish village, gave Sadler the ability to create obedient human soldiers without the need for traditional military equipment, training, or loyalty. Infected hosts, the ganados, would follow commands without hesitation, fight without fear, and continue fighting through injuries that would incapacitate normal soldiers. Sadler's plan to infect Ashley Graham and return her to the White House was designed as the opening move in a global replacement of conventional warfare with biological control. He intended to seed the parasite into world leaders and create a network of compelled puppets. Had he succeeded, it would have made every previous Umbrella project look cautious by comparison. The village in Spain was not his headquarters. It was his prototype. The Las Plagas parasite controlled the dead as well as the living. One of the more disturbing biological details in the Las Plagas lore is the parasite's relationship with its host after death. Standard ganado plagas could not survive the death of their host. When the host died, the parasite died with it. However, Sadler's research team had developed a dominant species, Las Plagas, a superior strain of the parasite that could actually survive and operate independently of a dead host, emerging from the corpse in a free-floating form to attack independently or relocate to a new host. The regeneradors, the nightmare-inducing, heavily regenerating enemies in the island facility, are the most extreme example of Plagas-driven biology in the game, with parasites so thoroughly integrated with the host's cells that conventional damage is meaningless. Jack Krauser, Leon's former partner turned antagonist, was implanted with a dominant Plagas specifically because Sadler wanted a more reliably controllable asset than the ganados. The parasite gave Krauser his grotesque arm mutation during their final battle. Ada Wong's real name is unknown. Ida Wong, the name itself, is not real. It is a confirmed alias used by a Chinese-American spy and mercenary whose actual identity has never been revealed in 30 years of games, films, and supplementary materials. She is first mentioned by name in the original Resident Evil, in a letter written by a researcher named John to his girlfriend, signed Ada. She has a genuine relationship with that researcher. She used him for intelligence, but developed at least some authentic emotional connection with him before he dies during the T-virus incident at the Spencer Mansion. When she arrives in Raccoon City in RE2, she is already operating under the alias, her true background entirely concealed. Shinji Mikami has cited La Femme Nikita as a primary inspiration for Ada's design and character archetype when she was redesigned for RE4. Every time the series hints at who Ada really is, it pulls back. Her real name, her nation of birth, her original employer, all unknown. She remains, decades later, the most precisely constructed mystery in the franchise. Ada has worked for at least 4 different organizations. Ada Wong's professional history is a labyrinth. In RE2, she is operating on behalf of an unnamed organization, later implied to be connected to Wesker's pre-RE1 employer. In RE4, she is working directly for Albert Wesker, tasked with recovering Las Plagas samples for Tricell's research. In RE6, she is apparently operating as the leader of Neo Umbrella, but this turns out to be her double, Carla Radames, who was surgically and psychologically transformed into Ada's doppelganger by Derek Simmons, a man obsessed with Ada who wanted to possess a version of her. The real Ada in RE6 is working independently to stop Simmons. Between games, according to the animated film Resident Evil Damnation, she undertook an international intelligence operation in the Eastern Slav Republic, while also developing a real connection with Leon. The number of organizations Ada has served, betrayed, or simply used as cover is impossible to count precisely. The one constant is that her loyalty, when it exists at all, is exclusively to herself, and arguably to Leon Kennedy. Leon was supposed to start his first day of work on the day of the outbreak. Leon, Scott Kennedy's traumatic introduction to the world of bioterrorism, is made worse by one specific detail. He was not even supposed to be in Raccoon City yet. He had been assigned to the Raccoon City Police Department, and his first official day on duty was scheduled for September 25th, 1998. Days before that date, he received an anonymous phone call warning him to stay away from the city and delay his arrival. He ignored the warning, arrived in Raccoon City on September 29th, and found a burning city full of zombies on what was technically his first day at work. He had never once reported to the actual police station before it became a war zone. He entered the RPD as a rookie officer in full uniform, badge still new, and spent the next several hours protecting himself and every civilian he could reach through sheer determination and improvised tactics. Leon Kennedy became one of the most effective counter-bioterrorism agents in the world, starting from an evening that was, by all rights, his orientation period. The T-virus was delivered to Raccoon City through the water supply, but the G-virus spread through contact. The distinction between how the T-virus and G-virus spread is critically important to understanding the events of RE2. The T-virus contaminated Raccoon City's water reservoir and spread through consumption, creating the citywide zombie outbreak. It is a relatively stable, transmissible pathogen. The G-virus, developed by William Birkin as a next-generation bioweapon, operates differently. It can only be transmitted through direct injection of G cells into a host's body, but the resulting infection causes the host to enter an aggressive parasitic state, attempting to implant G embryos into other humans who have a compatible genetic structure. This is why Sherry Birkin, who was implanted with a G embryo, only survived because of her specific genetic compatibility with her father William. The G virus is in many ways more dangerous than the T virus. Its mutations are faster, more extreme, and almost entirely unpredictable. But its transmission limitations prevented the outbreak from spreading beyond Raccoon City in the same way the T virus had. Chris Redfield was the original protagonist, but Jill plays the easier game. This is a detail baked into the original Resident Evil structure. When you select your character at the start of the game, you are choosing different difficulty levels wearing different faces. Chris Redfield's campaign is harder. He has less inventory space, starts with a basic knife only, and has access to fewer resources. Jill Valentine's campaign is more forgiving. She has significantly more inventory capacity and starts with a lockpick that allows her to open more doors. Plus she receives more resources and encounters Barry Burton, who provides assistance. Jill was designed as the entry point for newer players, which is why Barry explains the game's mechanics through their dialogue, while Chris was designed for players who wanted a more demanding experience. The famous Master of Unlocking line, Barry's compliment to Jill, is therefore not just a character moment. It is the game communicating the actual mechanical advantage Jill possesses over her counterpart. The lockpick represents an entire difficulty tier. Barry Burton was blackmailed into betraying his team. Barry Burton, the lovable, heavily armed, deeply quotable STARS member who assists Jill throughout the original Resident Evil, is also technically a traitor. Before the events of the game, Wesker approached Barry privately and threatened his family, his wife Kathy, and daughters Moira and Polly, telling him that if he didn't provide assistance and suppress information during the Stars investigation, they would be killed. Barry, cut off from communication in the pre-cell phone era and unable to verify whether the threat was real, complied. He provided Wesker with information, allowed members of his team to be put in danger, and withheld critical intelligence from Jill. He was operating under genuine duress, trying to protect people he loved, and Wesker eventually confirmed that Barry's family was never actually in danger. The whole threat was fabricated. Barry survives the canonical ending of the first game and redeems himself, returning to rescue Jill at the end of RE3 in a helicopter. His arc across the trilogy is one of the series' most complete character journeys, blackmailed coward to redemptive hero. Moira Burton was terrified of guns because of her father. Barry Burton's daughter Moira, who becomes Claire Redfield's partner in Revelations 2, has a crippling fear of firearms. She refuses to use a gun throughout almost the entire game, relying instead on a flashlight as a weapon and a crowbar as a last resort. The reason for her phobia is revealed as the game progresses. As a child, Moira accidentally discharged one of Barry's guns and wounded someone. The incident traumatized her so profoundly that she associated firearms with a loss of control and harm. She blamed herself. Her difficult relationship with Barry in Revelations 2, she had effectively estranged herself from her father by the time the game begins, is rooted in this guilt and the way it calcified into fear. Her arc in the game is literally about confronting that fear, and the moment she finally picks up a weapon to save those she cares about is one of the franchise's most understated but genuinely earned emotional moments. Barry Burton being unable to keep his daughter from being harmed by his gun is the most specific form of tragedy the series ever found. The BSAA was founded by Chris and Jill. The Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, the international counter-bioterrorism organization that Chris Redfield joins after the events of Raccoon City and serves as a member of through RE5 and beyond, was not an existing institution that recruited him. Chris and Jill were among its founders. After the destruction of Raccoon City and Umbrella's eventual legal collapse in 2003, the surviving members of STARS, along with other individuals who had first-hand experience with bioterrorism, formed the BSAA as a private organization dedicated to combating the spread of bioweapons on a global scale. It was later recognized as a legitimate international body sanctioned by various governments. The foundational idea was that Raccoon City could never be allowed to happen again, and the people who knew most viscerally how to prevent it were the ones who had survived it. Chris and Jill built their careers after the first game not by moving on, but by institutionalizing everything they had learned in the Spencer Mansion. Their response to trauma was to create infrastructure to stop it from recurring. Tricell was Umbrella, with better PR. After the legal and commercial collapse of Umbrella Corporation in the early 2000s, a collapse driven by the exposure of its bioweapons program and the subsequent worldwide litigation following the Raccoon City disaster, the corporation did not simply cease to exist. Its assets, research data, personnel, and ideological framework were absorbed by successor organizations. The most prominent of these was Tricell, a multinational pharmaceutical and energy corporation that appeared clean on the surface and was run by Excella Gione. In reality, Tricell had covertly acquired Umbrella's African research facilities and was continuing bioweapons development under the guise of legitimate science. Albert Wesker used Gion and Tricell to advance his Ouroboros project, providing her with access to Umbrella's archived research in exchange for resources and cover. The lesson RE5 makes explicit is that Umbrella was never truly defeated. Its research and its ideology survived the company's death, migrated into new corporate bodies, and continued exactly where it left off. Evil with better branding is still evil. Ouroboros was designed to kill most of humanity on purpose. Albert Wesker's Ouroboros virus, the biological weapon at the center of Resident Evil 5, was not designed to create BOWs or to infect specific targets. It was designed to reduce the world's human population to a fraction of what it currently was. Wesker's plan was to release Ouroboros into the atmosphere via a series of missiles, exposing the entire global population simultaneously. Those with the correct genetic makeup, a tiny minority, would survive, gaining enhanced abilities and entering what Wesker considered the next stage of human evolution. Everyone else would be consumed by the virus's tentacles, absorbed into a black mass of biological horror, dying in agony. Wesker estimated that only a few tens of thousands of people worldwide had the genetic compatibility to survive. The rest of humanity, billions of people, would die by design. This was not collateral damage. It was the intended outcome. The Spencer Foundation's dream of engineering the next humanity had been distilled by Wesker into a plan for mass extinction dressed up as evolution. Chris Punch, the boulder into a volcano. Resident Evil 5's climactic encounter between Chris Redfield and the mutated Albert Wesker in an active volcanic crater is one of the most discussed boss fights in gaming history, not for its design brilliance, but for its spectacular departure from anything resembling physics. Wesker, mutated beyond recognition by an overdose of Ouroboros, combined with the PG67A/W serum, meant to regulate his earlier viral infection, attacks Chris and Shaver with the full force of his post-human biology. And Chris, who at this point in the series' fiction is a military operator operating in his early 30s, responds by physically punching boulders into the lava, not small rocks, boulders, repeatedly, with apparent effectiveness. The development team at Capcom later acknowledged in interviews that the sequence was deliberately bombastic and over the top, an intentional escalation of Wesker's dramatic villainy and Chris's action hero status that pushed both archetypes to their absolute limit. It ended the Wesker era with a volcano and a rocket launcher, which is exactly the kind of ending a man who spent his entire life trying to become a god deserved. Jake Merler is Wesker's son and didn't know it. Jake Merler, the mercenary protagonist introduced in Resident Evil 6, spent the majority of his life with no knowledge of his father's identity. His mother raised him alone in Edonia, a fictional Eastern European country, and told him his father was an American. She was correct about the nationality. What she kept from him, possibly because she did not know, possibly because she could not process it, was that Jake Muller is the biological son of Albert Wesker. This makes Jake the sole direct heir to Wesker's genetic legacy, including natural antibodies against the C virus that make his blood uniquely valuable as a vaccine source. Jake's arc in RE6 mirrors his father's in inverted form. Where Wesker chose power over humanity, Jake begins the game as a mercenary selling his services to the highest bidder, but gradually chooses something more difficult. His reluctant heroism is not a rejection of his father's influence alone. It is Wesker's genetic potential choosing a different direction. The C virus was two of Capcom's worst viruses combined. The C virus, the central bioweapon of Resident Evil 6's sprawling global bioterrorism plot, was created by combining two of the most dangerous and unstable viral agents in the franchise's history. The T. Veronica virus, developed by Alexia Ashford in code Veronica, and the G virus, developed by William Birkin and responsible for the Raccoon City outbreak. By splicing these two together, the resulting chrysalid virus could be introduced alongside specific DNA to create customized BOWS, allowing for the production of targeted biological weapons with particular physical characteristics. The C virus could also be weaponized more easily than either parent strain, enabling mass airborne dispersal through aerosol delivery. Derek C. Simmons, the villain behind RE6's global bioterrorism plot, used the C virus to attack multiple countries simultaneously, infecting entire cities in a coordinated campaign. The virus is a worst of both worlds combination. The uncontrollable mutation potential of the G virus, plus the refined lethality of T. Veronica. The scientists who created its parents would have recognized it as their darkest possible collaboration. Carla Radames was transformed into Ada Wong, against her will. Among Resident Evil 6's most disturbing lore revelations is the story of Carla Radames, the woman operating as Neo Umbrella's apparent leader throughout much of the game, while appearing to be Ada Wong. Carla was a talented scientist who worked for the National Security Advisor Derek C. Simmons. Simmons was pathologically obsessed with Ada Wong, a woman who had once been his professional associate and had developed a deep fixation over her. When Carla Radames became aware of Simmons's true plans and began to pose a potential problem, Simmons chose to solve it in the most horrific way imaginable. He used the C virus to physically and psychologically transform Carla into Ada Wong. The process erased Carla's original identity, replacing it with Ada's appearance and a fragmented version of her personality. Carla eventually broke through the imposed personality and reclaimed her own identity. But she was trapped inside Ada's face forever. Her fury at Simmons, and by extension at Ada herself, drives much of RE6's most chaotic plot elements. She is one of the franchise's most quietly devastating secondary characters. Resident Evil 7 was designed as a direct response to fan criticism. By the time Resident Evil 6 launched in 2012, the series had drifted so far from its survival horror origins that Capcom publicly acknowledged they needed to change direction. RE6 had attempted to be multiple games at once: an action game for Leon, a military shooter for Chris, a mercenary thriller for Jake, and the result pleased almost no one fully. Producer Masachika Kawata stated explicitly that the company would return the franchise to focused horror. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard, released in 2017, was the product of that course correction. The development team drew explicit inspiration from PT, Konami's cancelled Silent Hills demo that had shocked the gaming world in 2014, and built a game that stripped away almost everything that had accumulated around the RE formula. New protagonist, first person, isolated setting, single family as the threat. The Baker family and their Louisiana plantation became one of the most effective horror environments in recent gaming, and the game's connection to the wider RE lore through Mia, Eveline, and eventually the BSAA was deliberately concealed until players were deep inside it. Eveline was designed to create her own family. Eveline, the bioweapon at the center of Resident Evil 7, appears to be a child, but is actually a genetically engineered organism created by a criminal syndicate called the Connections, using mold samples provided by Mother Miranda. She was designed to generate psychic control over other organisms through the mold pathogen, compelling them to form a protective family unit around her. The haunting psychological dimension of her character is that her drive to create a family was not a malfunction. It was her core programmed objective. The weapon was supposed to generate loyal hosts who would protect and transport her. The tragedy is that Eveline's definition of family, encoded by whatever reasoning the Connections used in her design, was absolute and unconditional. She could not process rejection or loss. When the Baker family she had infected showed signs of maintaining independent will, her response was to increase her control until they became monstrous. She was a child who wanted to be loved, and the mechanism of that wanting was a biological weapon. E7 treats her as a villain and a victim simultaneously, and the ending where an elderly Eveline dissolves while saying she just wanted a family is one of the franchise's most unexpectedly affecting moments. Jack Baker was the first and strongest mold-infected human. Jack Baker, the patriarch of the Baker family, and one of the most terrifying antagonists in the series, was the first person Eveline infected after she was discovered in the swamps of Louisiana. His infection is the most deeply embedded of the Baker family members, which explains his extraordinary resistance to damage throughout RE7. Jack can survive virtually anything Ethan can throw at him through much of the game, regenerating from injuries that would kill any conventional enemy. His late-game mutations push the biology further, producing ever more extreme physical transformations as the mold works through his compromised nervous system. What makes Jack deeply sad as a character is that he was, by every account, a kind and loving father before Eveline entered his life. The Baker's situation, a family destroyed from the inside by a parasite that mimicked the love their daughter never provided, mirrors themes from classic horror about domestic spaces corrupted by outside intrusion. Jack Baker terrorizes because he still believes, on some level, that he is protecting his family. Raccoon City actually had a population of about 100,000. The exact population of Raccoon City has been a subject of some inconsistency across the franchise's canon, but the most formally established figure from official sources is approximately 100,000 people. Earlier supplementary materials had implied larger numbers, and the city, as depicted in the games, certainly feels like a larger metropolitan area. But Resident Evil's canon documentation consistently references 100,000 as the death toll from the missile strike on October 1st, 1998. This means that the destruction of Raccoon City killed every single person still within the city limits at the time of the strike, both infected and uninfected. Whatever civilians had not evacuated in the chaotic days between the outbreak beginning and the missile arriving were killed. The US government's cover story, a nuclear power plant malfunction, could barely explain an event of that scale. The scandal led to the resignation of the sitting president. 100,000 people burned so that Umbrella's secrets and the government's complicity could be buried. The Arklay Mountains research was Spencer's personal secret playground. The Arklay Mountains, the region outside Raccoon City that houses the Spencer Mansion in the first game, was not chosen as a research location randomly. Oswald Spencer specifically selected it because it was accessible enough for logistics while being isolated enough for absolute privacy. The underground Arklay laboratory built beneath the mansion was Spencer's primary research facility, the place where the T-virus was refined and where the Tyrant project was conceived. The Spencer Mansion itself, the Gothic manor that became the franchise's most iconic setting, was designed as a residence and a cover simultaneously. Spencer threw dinner parties there. He entertained guests above the laboratory, where his scientists were creating monsters beneath their feet. The elaborate puzzles and traps built into the mansion's architecture were a deliberate feature rather than a design quirk. Spencer wanted his home to be impenetrable by accident as much as by design. The entire Arclay facility represents Spencer's philosophical self-conception. Beautiful surfaces, horror underneath. The first game had 2 extra playable characters that were cut. The final version of the original Resident Evil presented players with 2 character options, Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. Early in development, Capcom planned to include 2 additional playable characters who were eventually scrapped. The first was Geltzer, described as a heavily built radio operative with significant combat ability. The second was Dewey, an African-American medic, who the development team described as having been modeled on Eddie Murphy in terms of physical appearance and energy. Both characters were planned as playable options with their own item sets and perspectives on the mansion incident, but they were cut during development as the team refined and narrowed the game's scope. Neither character appeared in any form in the final product. The specific decision to cut them was driven partly by time and resource constraints, and partly by a desire to maintain tighter narrative focus on Chris and Jill, as the primary protagonists of what Capcom hoped would be an ongoing series. A queen in the code. There is a recurring queen, reference hidden across multiple Resident Evil games that fans have tracked for years. The British rock band Queen, of all things, has left Easter egg-sized footprints in the franchise. In the original Resident Evil, Chris Redfield's alternate costume features text on the back that reads "Made in Heaven," the title of Queen's 1995 album. In Resident Evil 2, the same phrase appears on the back of a jacket worn by Claire Redfield. These are not coincidences. Someone on Capcom's development team was a demonstrably enthusiastic Queen fan who smuggled tributes into consecutive games. The references are small enough that most players miss them entirely, and large enough that dedicated fans find them and wonder why Queen of all things is being honored inside a game about zombie outbreaks and bioterrorism. It is one of the more human and slightly absurd creative secrets hiding in the franchise. Proof that even the most earnest horror universe has room for a rock band tribute. Nemesis's real name is a tyrant number. The creature known as Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 is not a named being in the way protagonists are named. Its formal designation within Umbrella's bioweapons classification system is Nemesis T-type, a modified tyrant model enhanced through integration with the NE alpha parasite. The NE alpha parasite itself is a semi-autonomous organism capable of enhancing a host intelligence and providing direct neural control by an external operator. In Nemesis's case, Umbrella's research division issuing target directives. The Nemesis model represented a departure from the earlier Tyrant approach, which produced physically powerful but cognitively limited weapons. The integration of a living intelligent parasite with Tyrant biology created something that could track targets across complex urban environments, adapt its approach after repeated failures, and use weapons, the iconic rocket launcher, which prior Tyrant models could not manage. Nemesis was Umbrella's proof of concept for the next generation of intelligent bioweapons. It worked exactly as intended. The only problem was that Jill Valentine was harder to kill than the specifications anticipated. The Resident Evil 2 remake added lore the original never had. The 2019 remake of Resident Evil 2 did not simply update the visuals and controls of the original. It added, expanded, and deepened significant amounts of canonical lore. The characterization of Ada and Leon's relationship was explicitly extended, with director Kazunori Kadoi noting that the original game's romance moved too quickly, and the remake was designed to develop it more gradually and make Ada feel more genuinely manipulative of Leon's trust. Robert Kendo's fate was completely rewritten. In the original, he is killed by zombies. In the remake, he euthanizes his infected daughter Emma before taking his own life, a sequence that transforms a minor NPC encounter into one of the most devastating moments in the game. Marvin, Branag's backstory was deepened. Brian Iron's psychological pathology was made more explicit. The underground Nest laboratory was redesigned with additional documents that elaborated on Birkin's research. The remake is not a replacement for the original, but an expansion of it. The same events with more of the story visible. The RE engine changed everything. Resident Evil 7 and its successors, Village, the RE2 remake, the RE3 remake, and the RE4 remake, were all built on Capcom's proprietary RE engine, a development platform the studio created specifically to enable the kind of photorealistic, deeply atmospheric horror environments the franchise needed after RE6's overproduction. The engine supports real-time global illumination, highly detailed environmental destruction, and the kind of facial animation fidelity that allows characters to convey nuanced emotion. It was this engine that allowed Lady Dimitrescu's castle to feel genuinely cold and ancient, that made the Baker house feel like a real place rotting from within, and that gave the Raccoon City Police Department's corridors their convincing weight and shadow. The RE engine did not just improve graphics, it changed how survival horror could be structured at a fundamental level. And the string of acclaimed games Capcom released using it between 2017 and 2023 represents the most consistent critical run the franchise has ever produced. The merchant in RE4 has never been explained. Leon Kennedy's constant companion throughout Resident Evil 4, the mysterious hooded vendor who appears in impossible locations throughout the game to buy, sell, and upgrade weapons while asking, "What are you buying?" in a voice that has become one of gaming's most beloved catchphrases, has no canonical explanation. The game never identifies who the merchant is, where he comes from, how he is in multiple locations simultaneously, or why he is completely unafraid of the parasite-infected villagers and soldiers who attack everything else in sight. He simply exists. He helps. He sells rocket launchers to government agents on the run. Various theories among fans suggest he might be an Umbrella operative, a black market arms dealer who has developed some immunity to Las Plagas through financial arrangement with Sadler, or simply a narrative convenience that Capcom left deliberately mysterious as part of RE4's self-aware genre sensibility. The 2023 remake of RE4 kept him exactly as inexplicable as the original. Some mysteries are more valuable unsolved. The Regenerators were designed to be psychologically scarring. The Regenerators, pale, eyeless, disturbingly fleshy enemies in Resident Evil 4's island facility, who regenerate instantly from almost any damage and make an unsettling breathing sound, were specifically designed to induce maximum psychological discomfort in the player. Their appearance was developed to violate multiple instinctive disgust responses simultaneously. They are pale, proportionally wrong, breathe audibly in a way that suggests effort and suffering, and they cannot be killed by conventional means. Players must use a thermal scope to identify and destroy the Las Plagas parasites embedded in the creatures' bodies. This means that killing a regenerator requires sustained close attention to something that looks disturbingly wrong. The development team acknowledged in notes accompanying the game that the regenerators were designed not to be terrifying through jump scares, but through sustained dread, the kind of unease that comes from looking at something that looks almost right but isn't. The RE4 remake redesigned them to be even more visually disturbing than the original, leaning into biological wrongness with exceptional precision. RE5 was the best-selling game in the franchise at the time of its release. Resident Evil 5, released in 2009, is one of the franchise's most divisive entries. Its move toward action over horror, its co-op structure, and its Africa setting were all subjects of sustained critical debate. Some longtime fans found it too far from survival horror to feel like a true RE game. Others found the co-op gameplay with Sheva Alomar genuinely exhilarating. The commercial result was unambiguous. RE5 became the best-selling game in the franchise's history at the time of its release, moving millions of copies in its opening weeks and selling over 7 million copies in its first year. It held that sales record for years until the RE2 remake eventually surpassed it. The game's polarizing critical identity exists in tension with its extraordinary commercial success. RE5 demonstrated clearly that expanding the series' action elements brought new audiences to the franchise, which is exactly why RE6 pushed even further in that direction, and why the overcorrection that followed RE6's mixed reception eventually produced the franchise renaissance of RE7. The Resident Evil film series exists in its own non-canon universe. The 6 main Paul W.S. Anderson films featuring Mila Jovovich as Alice are not canonical to the video games in any way, and never were. Capcom's licensing relationship with Constantin Films in Germany allowed the film studio creative freedom to develop stories using the franchise's general aesthetic: the Umbrella logo, the T-Virus concept, Raccoon City, and character names, without being bound by game canon. Alice, the film's protagonist, was created specifically for the movies and appears in none of the canonical video game storylines. Characters from the games who appear in the films, Jill Valentine, Carlos Oliveira, Leon Kennedy, Claire Redfield, Ada Wong, Chris Redfield, are adapted versions that share names and rough characterizations, but differ significantly in backstory, motivation, and fate. The animated films, Degeneration, Damnation, and Vendetta, are canonical. The live-action Anderson films are their own closed universe, beloved by many viewers, but separate from 30 years of game lore. The Spencer estate in RE5 was the very beginning, the Lost in Nightmares. DLC for Resident Evil 5 takes Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine into the Spencer estate, Oswald Spencer's private mansion, set during the same autumn 2006 night when Wesker arrived to confront Spencer. This DLC represents a direct closing of the circle that began in 1996. The Spencer mansion of the first game was the Arclay research facility, Spencer's working compound. The Spencer estate shown in Lost in Nightmares was his private home, the seat of the aristocratic life he built around his eugenics ideology. The encounter between Wesker and Spencer there, the old man finally confessing everything to his most successful creation, and Wesker killing him for it, is one of the series' most dramatically satisfying moments. Spencer confesses that Umbrella was always about creating gods to replace humanity. Wesker kills him for the presumption of thinking Spencer would be their god, and Chris and Jill arrive moments later, too late to prevent it. The circle closed in the same kind of grand house where it opened. Spencer designed his own murder. When Oswell Spencer arranged for information about his secret European estate location to be leaked to Albert Wesker, he was not making a miscalculation. He was engineering his own death, or more precisely, he was testing Wesker one final time, hoping that the encounter would restore Wesker's programming and inspire him to complete Spencer's grand plan, rather than destroy it. Spencer was dying of natural causes, his aged body failing in the hidden estate where he had retreated after Umbrella's collapse. He wanted Wesker to receive his confession, understand his legacy, and carry it forward. What he did not account for was that Wesker had outgrown the need for Spencer's approval or authorization. When Spencer revealed that Wesker was the product of a eugenics experiment designed to serve Spencer's ambitions, Wesker's response was immediate and final. He killed Spencer before Chris and Jill arrived. Spencer built his own assassin over decades of meticulous planning and then walked directly into its hands. The man who designed the Wesker project never designed an exit from it. The G virus could theoretically repair any damage. William Birkin's G virus, which caused his own monstrous transformation, had one feature that distinguished it from every other viral agent in Umbrella's research catalogue: the capacity to repair dead tissue. The T virus could reanimate dead cells and restore basic motor function, but it could not truly heal. The G virus could theoretically repair any cellular damage given enough biological material, which is why the G-infected Birkin continued regenerating and evolving through successive mutations, even as his body was destroyed over and over by conventional weapons throughout RE2. Each regeneration produced a more extreme mutation because the G virus rewrote his biology from scratch each time, prioritizing survival and aggression over coherence. The theoretical medical applications of a controlled, non-lethal version of the G virus were enormous, which is why Spencer approved Birkin's G virus project despite the cost. Spencer needed a viral agent that could restore biological tissue for his own personal survival, long enough to see his eugenics plan completed. The G virus was simultaneously Umbrella's most dangerous creation and Spencer's selfish insurance policy. The four founders each wanted something different from the progenitor virus. The three founders of Umbrella who discovered the progenitor virus in 1966 each brought fundamentally different intentions to their collaboration, and those differences were what caused the company to become the catastrophic force it did. Edward Ashford, the most ethically grounded of the three, wanted to use the virus's mutagenic and regenerative properties to help people, specifically to address congenital disabilities and inherited medical conditions. His vision was the most benign, and he died before it could conflict meaningfully with the others' plans. James Marcus was obsessed with pure scientific discovery, wanting to understand the virus on its own terms and document the mutations it produced in various hosts. He was the one who actually created the T virus, and his eventual murder by his own students cut short a scientific mind that, whatever its ethical failures, was genuinely exploratory. Spencer wanted a god. He wanted to use the progenitor to create his own superior humanity and rule over it as its architect. Every virus, every outbreak, every city destroyed across 30 years of games flows from that divergence. One man wanted to heal. One wanted to know. One wanted to rule. Sherry Birkin became a government agent because of her blood. After surviving the Raccoon City incident as a child, Sherry Birkin, daughter of the man who created the G virus, herself a survivor of G virus infection, was placed under protective custody by the US government. She remained in that protective custody for years, essentially under house arrest, because her G-virus antibodies made her biologically valuable and potentially dangerous. The government needed to understand the long-term effects of surviving G-virus infection in a human host, and they were not willing to risk her knowledge or her biology being accessed by outside parties. When Albert Wesker was finally killed in 2009, the government's formal justification for keeping Sherry contained was removed, and she was released under the condition that she become an official government agent. Sherry Birkin's entire adult life and career trajectory was shaped by what happened to her as a 10-year-old girl in the sewers of Raccoon City. By RE6, she is a full government operative, partnered with Jake Muller, son of the man whose virus destroyed her father. Raccoon City's police station blueprints were based on a real design. The Raccoon City Police Department building in the original RE2 and its remake required extensive architectural planning to function as both a credible former museum and a puzzle box game space. The development team developed detailed internal floor plans for the RPD that established which rooms connected to which, where secret passages existed, and how the building's original museum layout had been modified for police use. These plans went into considerable detail about the building's history, including which sections had been renovated and which retained their original art museum function. The environmental storytelling visible throughout the RPD, the trophy cases, the decorative statues that serve as puzzle elements, the halls designed for exhibition rather than police work, all reflect careful pre-production documentation of a building that doesn't exist but was designed as if it does. The RPD's architectural illogic is its most beloved quality. Its charm comes from the tension between practical police use and grand artistic ambition that shaped it. The Raccoon City newspaper covered the outbreak with cover stories, one of the most detailed pieces of environmental storytelling in Resident Evil 2, and its remake involves the newspapers scattered throughout the game's early sections. The Raccoon City newspaper ran a series of increasingly unhinged cover stories as the outbreak began. The initial reports described the attacks as cannibalism incidents and attributed the violence to a mysterious disease spreading through the city. Later issues described the situations as civil unrest, while the editorial staff clearly struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing with what they were permitted to print. The papers form a miniature narrative of a city watching itself die, while its official media channels tried to maintain calm. This kind of environmental document design, using fictional news coverage to establish setting and tone, was one of the original RE's signature contributions to atmospheric storytelling, and subsequent entries in the franchise have returned to it repeatedly. Understanding that few things establish a sense of systemic failure better than watching the media fail in real time. Chris Redfield's character was radically redesigned for RE5. When Chris Redfield appeared in Resident Evil 5, longtime players of the series noticed something startling. He had apparently spent the years between RE1 and RE5 consuming an extraordinary amount of protein. The athletic but normally proportioned S.T.A.R.S. captain of the first game had become a hulking, barrel-chested operator who looked physically capable of arm wrestling a bear. The redesign was a deliberate response to Capcom's reading of the Western gaming market in 2008, which at the time was dominated by muscular military protagonists in games like Gears of War. The art direction for RE5's Chris leaned heavily into that aesthetic, producing a character whose proportions strain believability even within the heightened context of Resident Evil's world. The memes about Chris's arms began almost immediately upon the character's reveal, and they have never fully subsided. His design was quietly normalized in subsequent appearances, gradually walking back towards something more human-scaled without ever fully acknowledging the RE5 body was an outlier. Every STARS member was recruited by design. The STARS team, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service unit stationed in Raccoon City, was not assembled organically through normal police department hiring processes. Albert Wesker, working as Umbrella's embedded agent within the unit, specifically recruited members who would provide the best possible test subjects for the Tyrant project. The assignment of STARS Alpha and Bravo teams to investigate the Arklay Mountains incident was a deliberate setup. Wesker needed operatives skilled enough to penetrate the Spencer Mansion's defenses and reach the lower research facility, generating data on Tyrant performance in combat against trained human opponents. Every STARS member sent into that mansion was selected in part for what their performance data would tell Umbrella about the effectiveness of their BOWs. Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton. They were sent there to be killed as data points. The fact that they survived and brought down the facility was, from Umbrella's perspective, the experiment going catastrophically wrong. The founding trauma of the entire series was an experiment from the moment it began. The Raccoon City sewers were the only way out. One of the most overlooked aspects of the RE2 narrative's geography is how comprehensively the city's infrastructure collapsed around its survivors. The police station, the orphanage, the streets, all were overrun. The functional route to escape Raccoon City in the canonical storyline runs through the city's sewer system, which connected to Umbrella's underground nest laboratory. Leon and Claire did not choose the sewers because it was appealing. They chose them because every other route was blocked, destroyed, or full of G-infected creatures. The sewers themselves are home to crocodiles infected by the T-virus, which raises the question of how a sewer system large enough to house giant crocodiles was built beneath a Midwestern American city with a population of 100,000. The answer is that Umbrella's presence in Raccoon City caused the expansion of infrastructure that would never otherwise have existed there. The corporation's underground research presence required infrastructure, and that infrastructure became the only available escape route when everything above ground failed. Birkin was initially more brilliant than Wesker. Although Albert Wesker is remembered as the greater villain and the dominant intellect of the franchise's first era, the lore is clear that in their youth, William Birkin was considered at least Wesker's equal and possibly his superior as a pure scientist. When the two were identified as exceptional students at the Umbrella Executive Training Center in 1977, their instructor James Marcus singled both out as exceptional. But Birkin's specific gift was described as a combination of talent and ruthlessness that would serve Umbrella's research agenda particularly well. Birkin created the G-virus, one of the most remarkable biological innovations in the franchise, while still relatively young. His research proposals consistently attracted Spencer's funding and attention. The competition between the two men was real, and their eventual divergence, Wesker becoming a supervillain with aspirations to godhood, Birkin dying in a sewer while his own mutations consumed him, suggests that ambition and scientific genius are different things. Birkin was probably the better scientist. Wesker was the better survivor. The mold has a memory. The megamycete's most disturbing property, beyond its capacity to infect and transform living organisms, is its hive memory. the ability to preserve the consciousness and memories of every being it has ever consumed. This is the mechanism by which Mother Miranda found her daughter Eva preserved within it after a century of death. It is also the mechanism that allowed Ethan Winters to manifest within the Megamycete during R.E. Village's final act, communicating with Rose and helping her escape. And it is presumably the mechanism by which Rose's unusual abilities are partially explained. She was born of 2 mold-infected parents and grew up with some connection to this vast biological archive of lives. The hive memory transforms the Megamycete from a simple biological threat into something more philosophically unsettling. An ancient organism that has been recording human life for an incomprehensible span of time, accumulating the sum of every consciousness, unfortunate enough to be consumed by it. The horror of R.E. Village is not just what the mold does to bodies, it is what it does with souls. The Las Plagas parasite has ancient origins. The Las Plagas parasite encountered in Resident Evil 4 was not engineered by Umbrella or any modern bioweapons organization. It is a genuinely ancient organism that predates the 20th century by centuries. The parasite and the Los Iluminados cult that cultivated it had been embedded in the isolated Spanish village region for generations. Historical documents found throughout the game describe the parasite being sealed away by a powerful nobleman long before the 20th century began, when it had been used by the cult to control the population through religious terror. Sadler's achievement was finding and excavating the parasites from their sealed location and developing modern techniques to cultivate, implant, and direct them. The dominant and subordinate strains Sadler refined were his work, but the underlying organism is ancient, a naturally occurring parasite that the human population of a remote Spanish region had been weaponized by before recorded modern history. The corporate bioterrorism of the RE franchise's earlier games gives way in RE4 to something genuinely prehistoric. The RPD's architecture was never meant to be practical. The Raccoon City Police Department's original architect, whoever designed the building in its museum era, clearly had no intention of ever making it function as a practical law enforcement facility. The building's layout, with its elaborate central hall, its stained glass windows, its statues that require specific medallions to unlock doors, and its various wings accessible only through puzzle-based mechanisms, was designed for aesthetic grandeur and for the display of art. When the city purchased the museum and converted it, they adapted what they could and left what they couldn't change. This means the RPD's floor plan contains dozens of rooms that serve no logical police function, gallery spaces that became locker rooms, display halls that became evidence storage, back passages that lead nowhere useful. Chief Irons was reported to have been particularly fond of the building's original museum character and resisted further renovation throughout his tenure. The impractical beauty of the RPD is preserved because the man responsible for the building hated practical things. The Wesker project was hidden from 2 of Umbrella's 3 founders. Project W, Spencer's eugenics program to create a superior breed of humanity using the progenitor virus, was classified at such an extreme level that it was never shared with either Edward Ashford or James Marcus, Spencer's 2 co-founders of Umbrella. Both men knew about Umbrella's bioweapons research. Both participated in the T-Virus project. Neither of them knew that Spencer was simultaneously running a decades-long program to kidnap children and engineer humanity's replacement. The notes recovered in RE5 confirm that the project existed outside Umbrella's standard documentation systems, and that Spencer was deliberately keeping it from his collaborators. Marcus was murdered by Wesker and Birkin before he could ever have learned about the Wesker children. Ashford died of illness before the project's full scope became apparent. Spencer maintained absolute secrecy for decades, not because disclosure would have endangered the project specifically, but because he knew that even his ruthless colleagues would have found what he was doing disturbing. The founder of Umbrella was doing things that Umbrella's own founders would have rejected. Lisa Trevor was the proof of concept nobody wanted to acknowledge. Lisa Trevor, introduced in the Resident Evil remake as a recurring, unkillable horror lurking in the Spencer Mansion's grounds, is one of the franchise's most tragic figures and one of its most important lore revelations. Lisa was the daughter of a couple who worked for Spencer during the Spencer Mansion's construction in the 1960s. Spencer, seeking test subjects for early progenitor virus experiments, had the parents captured and used as test subjects. Lisa herself was subjected to multiple rounds of experimental injection with different viral strains, surviving each time in ways that baffled Umbrella's researchers. She developed an unprecedented bond with the progenitor virus, evolving abilities of adaptation and regeneration that exceeded anything the project had achieved. The corporation that tortured her spent years studying her, declared her results anomalous and non-reproducible, and moved on to other research, while she continued to haunt the property, reduced to madness, carrying her mother's face preserved in a jar. Lisa Trevor is the prototype for everything Umbrella achieved, the proof that progenitor survival was possible. And she was buried and forgotten in the woods. The Umbrella Noodle brand is a real thing. In the game's lore, in Resident Evil Outbreak, one of the collectible items players can discover is a container of Umbrella Corporation branded instant noodles. The item's description in the game reads, "Umbrella, Inc. makes food too. Tastes pretty good too." This small Easter egg implies that within the fiction of the Resident Evil universe, Umbrella Corporation's pharmaceutical and consumer products were extensive enough to include a food division. The game treats this as a darkly comic detail. The company responsible for zombie plagues also makes instant noodles, and by all accounts, they're decent. It is a piece of environmental comedy hiding inside one of the darkest settings in survival horror. It also inadvertently raises a genuine lore question. How much of Raccoon City's food supply came from Umbrella's consumer brands? How thoroughly had the corporation embedded itself in everyday life before it destroyed that life? The noodle brand is a joke with implications. The BSAA was eventually compromised too. Resident Evil Village's opening act drops a revelation that retroactively recontextualizes much of the post-RE5 era. The Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, the organization that Chris Redfield has served and partly built since Raccoon City, has been infiltrated by an unknown faction. In Village's opening, Chris apparently shoots Mia Winters dead in front of Ethan before having him transported to Eastern Europe. The BSAA soldiers Chris is working with in the village are revealed, by the game's end, to be cloned BOW soldiers rather than real humans, meaning someone with advanced bioweapons capability has managed to plant manufactured soldiers inside the organization Chris co-founded. The BSAA that was created as a response to Umbrella's atrocities has been infiltrated by forces using Umbrella-style technology. The cycle of corporate infection and institutional corruption that began with the first game has apparently never ended. Every institution built to stop the horror eventually becomes vulnerable to it. The original Resident Evil was never supposed to be a franchise. When Shinji Mikami directed the original Resident Evil, neither he nor Capcom's leadership anticipated building a franchise. The game was developed by a team of primarily young and inexperienced developers at a company whose internal priority was Street Fighter, and the project was considered a lower-tier commercial gamble on new PlayStation hardware. The internal attitude toward the project, as described by members of the original team, was one of creative freedom born from low expectations. Nobody senior was watching closely, because nobody expected it to matter commercially. When the game sold over 2 million copies and generated critical acclaim that defined an entirely new genre, Capcom was surprised. The sequel was greenlit quickly, and the franchise concept was built after the fact. Resident Evil was not designed as a long-running series with interlocking mythology. It was designed as a single game. Everything after it, the T-Virus Project, the Wesker Arc, Mother Miranda, Ethan Winters, was built on a foundation that was never meant to support a 30-year structure. And somehow, it held. Capcom broke a promise to Nintendo over RE4. When Resident Evil 4 was announced as part of the Capcom 5, a group of 5 games committed as Nintendo GameCube exclusives. Capcom's producer Shinji Mikami was asked about the possibility of ports to other platforms. His response was enthusiastic and absolute. He stated in a Famitsu interview that if Resident Evil 4 was ever ported to PlayStation 2, he would cut his own head off. This commitment was made in the context of Capcom's desire to demonstrate serious support for the Nintendo's hardware. Resident Evil 4 released exclusively on GameCube in January 2005. By October of that year, a PlayStation 2 port had been announced. Mikami did not lose his head. He did, however, leave Capcom not long after RE4's completion, reportedly citing creative differences that had been building throughout the project. The PS2 port eventually sold more copies than the GameCube original, suggesting the commercial logic was sound, even as the broken promise lingered in Nintendo fan memory. RE4 eventually appeared on more hardware platforms than any other entry in the franchise. The Raccoon City Police Department's STARS unit was Umbrella's tool from the beginning. The STARS unit wasn't just infiltrated by Wesker. It was, in a broader sense, constructed as a tool. Capcom's supplementary materials reveal that Umbrella had cultivated relationships with Raccoon City's political establishment, including its mayor and police chief, for years before the events of the games. The creation of an elite special tactics unit within the RPD was partly facilitated by Umbrella's influence, because having a skilled combat-capable unit available within the city made it possible for Umbrella to control how any response to their activities would be handled. Irons was their man inside the police department. Wesker was their man inside STARS. The entire institutional apparatus that should have been Raccoon City's defense was owned before the danger ever arrived. When Bravo Team was sent to investigate the Arklay Mountains, it was sent there by a police department already compromised by the company it was sent to investigate. The Spencer Mansion incident did not begin because a competent institution failed. It began because every institution that could have stopped it was already controlled. William Birkin's daughter grew up to protect the world he destroyed. Sherry Birkin, who survived RE2 as a child infected by her father's G virus, has a deeply specific relationship to the franchise's history. Her father, William Birkin, created the G virus, which infected her and nearly killed her. Her father's research contributed to the destruction of Raccoon City, killing the world she knew as a 10-year-old. And Sherry survived specifically because of the very virus her father made, her body developing the G virus antibodies that kept her alive while others died. She grew up in government custody. defined by her connection to the disaster, and she became, in RE6, a government agent working to prevent exactly the kind of bioterrorism her father's research had enabled. The daughter of the man most directly responsible for Raccoon City's fall spent her adulthood trying to ensure nothing like it ever happened again. She spent that adulthood doing it in a body that only survived because of what he created. Sherry Birkin is the franchise's most precise embodiment of inherited consequence. The stars badge on Jill's beret still means something. Jill Valentine's iconic blue beret with the STARS insignia has appeared in one form or another across almost every one of her canonical appearances. It is one of the most recognizable visual elements in the franchise, but the badge represents something specific in the lore. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service was Jill's entire professional identity before Raccoon City. She was a member of Delta Force before joining STARS, and the transition to Raccoon City represented what should have been a relatively comfortable senior position in a specialized unit. The destruction of STARS, the killing of her teammates, the betrayal by Wesker, the citywide disaster she barely survived, stripped everything that represented her professional life away. She keeps the beret not out of simple habit. She keeps it as a memorial and a reminder. When she co-founds the BSAA, when she operates in RE5, when she fights Wesker in the Spencer estate, she is still STARS. She is still the woman from Raccoon City, carrying a unit that no longer exists and a city that no longer exists, forward into every fight that comes after. The Resident Evil franchise has sold over 150 million units. Resident Evil is one of the best-selling video game franchises in history. By the mid-2000s, cumulative series sales have surpassed 150 million units across all platforms and releases. This includes the original games, remakes, spin-offs, and mobile entries. The franchise's commercial renaissance following the release of Archer E7 in 2017 accelerated its growth significantly, with each subsequent remake performing at or above expectations and RE Village becoming one of the fastest-selling entries in the series' history. The RE2 remake sold over 5 million copies in its first year, more than the original RE2 sold across its entire commercial lifetime. RE4's 2023 remake sold 4 million copies in its first week. The franchise that began as an unexpected success on original PlayStation hardware, created by young developers with limited resources at a company that didn't consider it a priority, became one of the most commercially and critically consistent horror properties in all of entertainment. The progenitor virus, found in a West African garden in 1966, turned out to be quite the foundation. The Ashford family line was built on stolen credit, the Ashford family name that Alfred and Alexia carry into the events of Code. Veronica was built on a legacy their ancestor had no right to claim. Founder Edward Ashford's son, Alexander Ashford, who was responsible for creating the Antarctic facility and the Ashford twins, was a man of modest scientific talent operating in the shadow of the family's reputation. When it became clear that the true genius of the Ashford bloodline had thinned in his generation, Alexander cloned the DNA of his ancestor's most celebrated partner, a woman known only as Veronica, to produce children who would carry that genetic brilliance forward. Alexia and Alfred were not simply born. They were engineered to restore prestige to a family whose standing depended on scientific achievement. Alexia received Veronica's genius. Alfred received something more fragile. The T. Veronica virus that Alexia eventually developed was therefore named in honor of the original woman whose stolen genetic material made Alexia possible. The entire Ashford legacy is a monument to manufactured greatness built on an act of quiet desperation. Carlos Oliveira was never actually an Umbrella employee. Carlos Oliveira, the charming mercenary who helps Jill Valentine survive the events of Resident Evil 3, was not a direct Umbrella employee in the way most players assume. He was a member of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, the UBCS, a private military organization contracted by Umbrella specifically to operate in biohazardous environments. The distinction matters. UBCS soldiers were recruited largely from mercenary markets and former military, many of them with criminal backgrounds or desperate circumstances, and they were given significantly less information about the nature of their missions than Umbrella's internal research staff. Carlos genuinely believed the unit was performing rescue and containment operations with legitimate humanitarian purpose. When the reality of Umbrella's intentions became clear in Raccoon City, Carlos's decision to help Jill rather than follow his organization's interests was a defection, not a betrayal, because he was never truly invested in what Umbrella stood for. He was a hired gun who discovered he had a conscience, which is among the more effective character arcs in the series' supporting cast. The knife in RE games is always the last line of defense. Across the franchise's history, the combat knife has occupied a specific symbolic role that transcends its mechanical function. In the original game, Chris begins with only a knife, reinforcing his comparative disadvantage versus Jill's fully equipped starting kit. In code, Veronica, the knife Steve Burnside carries, becomes a crucial narrative object in the game's most emotional sequence. In RE4, Leon's knife is the tool that saves him from Krauser in their knife-only confrontation, a deliberate callback to the idea that basic weapons, mastered, can defeat extraordinary opponents. But the RE4 remake elevated this to something extraordinary. The knife became breakable, with durability that depletes through combat use and parrying, forcing players to manage it as a resource. The remake also made the knife Leon's defensive tool for escaping grabs, adding survival weight to every knife durability point. RE7 took this further still, using knife-equivalent tools to force players into physical engagement with enemies at dangerous proximity. In every generation, the knife means you have reached the end of options. Use what you have left. Resident Evil 0 was originally a Nintendo 64 game, Resident Evil 0, the prequel that follows Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen through the events preceding the first game's Spencer Mansion incident, began development in 1998 as a Nintendo 64 exclusive. The game was intended to release on cartridge for the N64, and significant development work was completed for that format before Capcom ultimately cancelled the N64 version and moved the project to GameCube instead. The transition to GameCube hardware allowed the development team to implement significantly more ambitious environments and the partner-swapping mechanic that became central to the game's design, a feature that was impossible to implement effectively on N64's more limited cartridge capacity. The most significant casualty of the platform shift was time. RE0 didn't release until 2002, years after it was originally announced. The game's primary distinction in the lore is that it shows the precise moment the T-Virus transformed the Umbrella Executive Training School's population, providing the connective tissue between James Marcus's murder in 1978 and the Arclay outbreak that begins the first game's story. The Tyrant project was about creating the perfect soldier. The Tyrant program, Umbrella's long-term project to create a humanoid bioweapon capable of following commands, surviving extreme damage, and performing targeted elimination, was not conceived as a weapons research program in the traditional sense. Spencer's original vision for the Tyrant was much grander. He wanted to create the prototype for the new humanity, a post-human organism that combined the T-virus's mutagenic power with retained human intelligence and the capacity for directed aggression. The various Tyrant models produced across the franchise's early games represent successive iterations toward that goal. The T-002 from the Spencer Mansion was early generation, physically powerful but limited in intelligence. The T-103 models deployed in Raccoon City represented refinement. Nemesis was a breakthrough that pointed toward the intelligent weapon Spencer had originally envisioned. The Tyrant wasn't just a monster, it was Umbrella's answer to the question of what a soldier would look like if biology replaced armor, training, and loyalty. The answer turned out to be something nobody could reliably control. Rebecca Chambers was 17. During the Spencer Mansion incident, Rebecca Chambers, the medic of Bravo team and one of the few star survivors of the Spencer Mansion incident, was 17 years old when the events of Resident Evil and Resident Evil Zero took place. She graduated from a university program in biochemistry at an extraordinary age and joined STARS as their field medic before she had finished being a teenager. The lore has never been entirely consistent about the exact mechanism that got her onto the team so young, but the canon age is unambiguous. When she encounters Billy Cohen in RE0 and navigates the Umbrella training facility and the Ecliptic Express, she is doing it as a teenager with no prior combat experience and barely any field experience at all. Her survival through both RE0 and the Spencer Mansion's events in RE1, where she appears briefly before Chris Redfield's arrival, is a testament to her adaptability, intelligence, and the medical knowledge that repeatedly proves more useful than brute force. She remains one of the franchise's most underused characters, given the dramatic potential of her backstory. The interrogation room in RE4's castle contains dark history. Among the rooms that Ethan Winters, and before him, Leon Kennedy, passes through in the castle section of Resident Evil 4, the dungeon-like interrogation spaces hold particularly grim lore. The documents found in those areas reveal that the castle predates Sadler's cult by centuries and was used by the region's nobility for the kind of judicial horror common to medieval European power. The cult's adoption of the castle was not simply a matter of finding useful space. Sadler deliberately selected a location with a pre-existing atmosphere of institutional violence and confinement, understanding that environments carry psychological weight. The castle's history of suffering, the real secular suffering of a feudal power structure, provided a foundation on which the cult's religious terror could be layered. The RE4 remake deepened this specifically, adding documents that fleshed out the castle's pre-cult history and clarified that the suffering within its walls long predated the Las Plagas parasite. Sadler inherited evil real estate and used it well. The Ganados retain more intelligence than standard T-virus zombies. One of the most significant biological distinctions in the franchise is the difference between T-virus zombies and Las Plagas infected Ganados. T-virus hosts are effectively dead. Their higher cognitive functions are destroyed. They move by basic biological impulse, and they cannot coordinate or communicate. Las Plagas hosts retain enough of their own brain function to coordinate group tactics, use tools and weapons, communicate verbally, operate machinery, and follow complex orders. This means that every Ganado Leon faces in RE4 is to some degree still a person. A villager or soldier who has been overridden by a parasite, but whose body and some cognitive framework remain operational. The horror of fighting ganados is different from fighting zombies because of this retained humanity. When they call out to each other, turn off lights to use darkness against you, or set up ambushes, they are doing things that no T-virus zombie could do. They are people being used as weapons, their will supplanted, their bodies still functioning. The Las Plagas represents a more insidious kind of monster, one that wears the living.